This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Monteverde Rose Noir. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did previously on papers of varying quality. I'll compare Monteverde Rose Noir to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Rose Noir was pleasant to write with using a glass dip pen. It came off the nib nice and uniformly. The ink swatch that I did with tweezers was nice and crisp, and the color is also pretty uniform. I don't see any sheen on the drip at the end of the swatch, but there's a halo of darker color, and you kind of see that effect in the letters. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. The feel of the nib on the paper was very pleasant. My only concern with this ink and nib combination is the legibility, since it's a little bit light, but the letters are nice and crisp, and the feel of the nib on the paper is very nice. For an extra fine nib, this is pretty smooth. Next, I've got a Monteverde Pocket Rytma. It has an unmarked Omniflex nib. It's smaller, comparable to a number 5 size nib. I had to try this Monteverde ink with my Monteverde Pocket Rytma. I've had issues with this pen before because the nib, let's see if I can get, this nib is so black it's hard to get the camera to focus on it. See how far out past the feed the nib extends, these longer flexi tines. With some inks it tends to dry out and I have issues with hard starts. I've enjoyed using Diamine Earl Grey, which that ink has a similar consistency, I feel like, to this Rose Noir. They're both pretty watery, and I love the feel of Earl Grey in this pen, and this Rose Noir gives me the same feeling. I really like it. It's very nice. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This is quite a bit wetter than the first two. The Rytma was quite a bit wetter than the extra fine, and this is just a really pleasant nib and ink combination. It looks good on both of these pens. That rose color really stands out, but not too much. You've got a little bit of the noir to keep it from being too bright. And I wouldn't call this smooth, but again, it's just very nice. It's smoother than the first two pens, but still just a little bit of feedback. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Not quite as wet as the Pilot, but had a little bit of feedback, a little more feedback than the Pilot. But these three nibs right here on all the writing samples I've been doing, I've just enjoyed these three so much. I think on this really smooth Tomoe River paper, the Platinum is my favorite. I'm going to put feedback because there is a noticeable amount of feedback, but it is very nice. I enjoy the sound of that feedback. I like the look of the letters with this pen. I've found that with kind of lighter colored, more translucent inks, maybe inks that tend to have a shading as a quality of the ink, I really enjoy using this Platinum, and this is one of those inks that the Platinum Medium really works well with. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. Usually I don't like these type of inks in the Metropolitan. You can tell by comparing the writing sample, the Metropolitan really lightens up the ink, or I should say the calligraphy medium nib really lightens up the ink. It's drier than the previous three nibs, and you're really just getting the rose color, not much of the noir. But if that's what you want, this is a good pen for that because it's still nice and smooth even with it being so dry. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel double broad nib. Nice and wet, but not too wet. You're getting some nice shading here and very smooth. Very fun to write with. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stub nib. A little bit of a hard start there. Not the usual glassy smoothness that I'm used to with this nib, but I would call it velvety smooth. It still just feels like a very luxurious writing experience. While that dries, I'll take a look at some of the other writing samples. On Tomoe River paper, I was kind of surprised. This is one of the first writing samples I do when I get an ink. I was surprised by how uniform this swatch was, the color of it. But then when I see the writing samples, I'm still seeing some nice shading. And part of the uniqueness of this ink is, like I mentioned earlier, that halo of darkness that you see around the letters. Let me see if I can get in close. You really see it on like the Platinum and the Rytma. I don't know if you can see it in this lighting, and the stub nib, you get some nice shading. So you can see I really liked this ink in all the nibs. The only thing is this extra fine nib, it puts down such a fine, crisp line. If you want to have a very fine line, this is a good ink for that because it's still pleasant. It's not scratchy, but it puts down so little ink and the ink doesn't spread. Just very nice. I don't believe this is 20-pound copy paper. I ran out of my poor quality thin 20-pound copy paper and asked my husband to bring a sheet from work, and I got absolutely no bleed through. And just to make sure, I did a writing sample on a little empty space from a previous video, and it does bleed through 20-pound copy paper. But the writing experience on here was a little bit different than the Rhodia. I was kind of surprised that the Pilot was smoother on this paper than it was on the Rhodia. And usually on copy paper, the Pilot, my Pilot fine nib, feels a little too wet. The ink is kind of blobby. It just writes a beautiful, perfect line with this ink. So this does seem to be a pretty good ink to use with poor quality paper. In my Leuchtturm, there's nice shading, but also that halo around the letters. Just very pretty. And the writing experience on Leuchtturm paper, I always enjoy it. When I started writing with Rose Noir, I thought, oh, this is a unique ink. I don't think I have anything like this in my collection. But when I was going through, Yozakura is a much less saturated, but looks like a similar type of ink. The kind of shading that I'm getting, it's a similar kind of ink, just much less saturated. Krishna Winter Sheen is also similar but much brighter. And as I'm looking through my viewfinder, it's brighter in real life. Not a lot brighter, but a bit. I was surprised by how similar Sailor Manyo Akebi was. I've got a little bit more noir in the Rose Noir, but they are very similar when I'm looking at the writing. Akebi has much more sheen though. Herbin Poussière de Lune has a little more of the noir, and it's a drier ink. The water resistance test surprised me. I was expecting the rose to lift off the page and the noir, the gray or black, to be left behind, and it was the opposite. Rose Noir is not water resistant. You get a little bit of the rose left behind, but it's difficult or impossible to read. Usually I submerge the writing samples for 10 minutes, but this one got left for 14 minutes, and it is not water resistant. Okay, let's take a look at the back of this page. Nothing came close to bleeding through, even in the heavy parts of the swatch and the scribble. I just liked writing with every pen. I suppose on the Rhodia, let me see. On the Rhodia, the Rytma was my favorite because it had a little bit of the feedback like the Platinum, and it was nice and wet like the Pilot. It was just, the Rytma was a nice combination of these two. The Platinum and the Pilot were nice also. On the poorest quality paper, I think the Pilot was my favorite. It was nice and smooth and wrote a surprisingly nice line. The Platinum was a close second. And the Metropolitan was also nice. On my smoothest paper, this Tomoe River, I think the Platinum was my favorite. It gave me just enough feedback that I had a little more control. And I liked the sound of the feedback. And I like, look at that line that it puts down. Honestly, I'm surprised. Every time I use Monteverde inks, I'm surprised by how much I like them. I should be catching on now that Monteverde makes good inks. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.